My first encounter with a computer was at school in about 1979. The maths teacher, for some reason, had bought one and brought it into the school, and he introduced me to BASIC. And it was extraordinary because you could see the power of being able to take control of a machine and get it to do things. And in those days, of course, we'd seen the moon landing, and we'd heard about rudimentary computers. And these computers, even though they were incredibly basic by today's standards, were more powerful and had more memory than the computers that landed man on the moon. So to us, this was really extraordinary. It was opening up a world that just felt so incredibly exciting. When I was at school deciding what degree I wanted to do, I really had very little idea, and my family, a number of them had been engineers. My grandfather had gotten an OBE for building bridges in India, and so it seemed a reasonable thing to go into engineering. So I was offered a fantastic placement at Ford on what was called the Special Engineering Programme. We were going to be the captains of industry. And then when I arrived at Ford and I started working, it became clear. I mean, the British car industry was in a really dire strait at that particular point. And actually my dream of Victorian engineering brought into the modern day just didn't come to pass. I wasn't the world's greatest engineer, and I didn't particularly enjoy it. But at Ford, I met a friend, Richard Turner, who was also on the same sponsorship scheme. And he just started a computer games company called Arctic Computing in Hull. And one weekend he said, well, why don't you come and see what we're doing? And he introduced me to his partner, Chris Thornton, who was a programmer. And we started playing some games on the TRS-80, which was an import from the US. It opened up all these opportunities. It was absolutely amazing. And the ZX81 was coming out around about that time. I don't know if it had come out at that point. And Richard and Chris asked me if I'd like to write some adventure games, which I did. And that was my introduction into the computer games industry. Inca Curse was the first adventure game that I wrote, and the first interactive story that I wrote. And it was such fun. And what was amazing is we'd then go to what were called microfairs at the time, and you'd meet people who played the games and loved them. And it was the most extraordinary thing. And I remember the first time somebody actually asked me to sign the front of the cassette, and I felt like a rock star. But it was great because you could talk to the people who played these games. They'd tell you what they loved and what they didn't love. So then I left university in about 1984, 85, and went to work full-time at Arctic. But the golden era had passed, and it was actually very, very tough. And there were great games, particularly coming out of the US. I remember Impossible Mission, and playing that and realising that actually we were just so far behind what the Americans were doing at this stage. And then through the post popped an envelope, and in it was a game for the Amstrad CPC called Obsidian, written by a local lad, Tony Warriner. And this game was so much better than anything we were doing.
I'd sat and written this game called Obsidian on my Amstrad CPC computer, and I did this when everyone else was revising for their exams, and I decided not to revise for my exams because writing this game was a lot more fun. So I did that instead. Managed to fail on my exams, which was actually my intention. The only question I got right on them was my name that you had to put at the top of the exam sheet. I got that right, spelt it right, failed everything else. But I'd written this game, sent it to Arctic because it was the nearest place to where I lived, about 20 miles away, and went along, and he took me out for lunch at the pub and talked about how many zillion units we were going to sell of this game, and took it from there, and amazingly it was like finished a few weeks later and published. It was really quite easy in those days.
At Arctic, we desperately needed this game and put a lot of work into trying to woo Tony, but then Tony licensed it to us, and then he came to work in-house at Arctic, and that's really where our business relationship and our friendship stemmed from. This was around about 1986.
And they kind of never actually gave me a job as such. You wouldn't call it a job, but Charles Starr suggested that I actually went in there. It's kind of a Charles job. You didn't have a job, but you were required to be in the office all the time. So I used to go to Arctic, and the first thing they got us to do, me and another lad that was there called Adam Waring, they got us to do this. The famous World Cup football thing, Mexico '86, which we were blissfully unaware at that point of what a storm it was about to cause the whole project.
We were really running into financial difficulty. There was we were very naive. We spent money very, very foolishly. And then I got a call from Tim Cheney at US Gold. And Tim asked if we could write a football game. They'd licensed Mexico 86. And they asked if we could use our Arctic soccer game.
US Gold basically were writing their own Mexico 86 game, and something went wrong with it, I think. And at the last minute, they realised they weren't going to have this game ready in time for Mexico 86. So they rang up Arctic and arranged to license their football game and repackage it as the official Mexico 86 game. And obviously this was quite a bad thing to do, because I don't think it was a great football game anyway, the Arctic one. And it certainly wasn't. It wasn't, pardon the pun, big league in any way. It was pretty modest. So they decided to tart it up a bit with some extra sub games and some like charts and posters, and put it in a fancy box and all the rest of it. So we were unwitting pawns in this plan of evil.
So we undertook to write Mexico 86, but it was very much on the proviso that we were not allowed to talk about anybody, not announce it at all. Because, I mean, we felt really guilty because it was quite clear that when this game released, people were going to look at it and go, but it's.
And you know, when people found out what it was, some people obviously had the Arctic game, and when they bought this Mexico 86 game, they knew what had happened and what had been done, and there was a big outcry. It wasn't a popular thing at all.
And for many, many years afterwards, I personally was blamed for this, which I tried to shake off. I tried to blame other people, but ultimately that managed to stick with me. Thankfully, nobody's mentioned it for a few years now. I think maybe people have kind of moved on. But that saved Arctic for a year or so. But then the writing was very much on the wall.
Arctic kind of split into two, probably about a year later, a year after I started working there, and it broke off into another company called Paragon Programming, which was exclusively Charles's, and that company was based in London, in Battersea, and its job was to do conversions for mostly US Gold, I think. So they were taking American games like Commodore 64 games from the States, and then we were porting them to the Sinclair Spectrum. That was mostly what Paragon did, which is how Charles got involved with US Gold.
US Gold then invited me to become their development manager, their head of development, which sounded like a wonderful opportunity. So I wound Paragon up, and Tony actually went off and worked for various other companies. And I worked for US Gold, and then moved on to work for Activision. I'd been poached by Rod Cousins, who I'd met many years earlier when he was running a company called Quicksilver, which was one of the pioneering early video games, computer game publishers. And I met Noreen at Activision. She was involved with the Sierra brand, and Sierra was hugely successful. Activision were distributing a lot of games from American publishers, including Sierra. And she was responsible for that. And I was really interested by Sierra because I loved adventure games. I'd traditionally written adventure games, and when I later decided that I wanted to set up a new development company, it was very much aimed at being a Sierra beta.
He had this idea that he wanted to set up his own company. He'd had a company previously writing games, and he was really interested at the time, and I didn't know this until subsequently, he was interested in what I was doing at Activision because I was the brand manager for Sierra. He was interested in the Sierra games, the adventures, and how they were doing in their marketing.
When a friend of mine from many years before, called Sean Brennan, he was running a company, he was the deputy at a company called Mirasoft, owned by Robert Maxwell, who was a newspaper tycoon at the time. And he phoned me up and he took me out to lunch and he said, look, we will support you if you want to go back into development and start a development company.
In fact, I think it was over lunch, I think in Reading, which is where Activision were based in that area, and I gave him some encouragement, really. I mean, Charles always gives me way too much credit for all these things, but certainly some encouragement to say, look, if you want to get into, if you want to start your own software development studio, we'll support you. We're looking for talented people to produce, widen our portfolio at the time. So we'd certainly give you some very, very strong support then. So, come back to us, give us a plan, and hopefully we can support you.
Tony was desperate to get back into games. He was working for an aeronautical company, a software company, and his colleague David Sykes wanted to get into games. He'd never worked in games before. So Tony suggested that we take on Dave. So we had this little nucleus that formed.
Charles rang me up and said, have you seen some Sierra games that are doing well at the moment? Leisure Suit Larry, he said, go and have a look at Leisure Suit Larry. So we got a copy of that and played it, and then he said, can you do that? And we said, yeah, easy. And he said, come meet me in Wales, where his mother has a nice cottage in the middle of nowhere. He said, and I said, I'll bring my mate Dave, because he's a pretty good programmer. And we went away, and that was the beginning of Revolution.
For me, what Charles, Dave and Tony were doing was really exciting, because I had a knowledge of the adventure sector through the Sierra Online work that I was doing. I began to really like that genre. I wanted to be part of that. That's what attracted me to it. I had done the publishing bit. I had been the observer, and I really wanted to actually be part of it, in the making of it.
We had Tony and Dave working in Hull on absolutely a shoestring. And we went for the cheapest rent that we could find. And the cheapest rent was above a fruit shop in Chandler's Avenue in Hull.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hi, Dave. Really nice to see you.
You.
Do you remember this
You
place?
found it then?
We did.
Did,
We
yeah.
found it.
Dave. All right, Charles. So, this is where it happened.
I think I was funding you, about 50 quid a week, or just
No,
about
no,
as much as I could afford.
I think it was about 20 quid a month on it. They couldn't have reasonably charged us much more than that.
Because I remember you complaining that it got cold.
It was freezing
Yeah.
because there was no heating.
This is like warm. It was like a special biosphere in there. It was like
So we
different
got
weather inside, wasn't it?
So
It
we
was
got a
back in the
gas-
days when winters were cold, and it really was cold. We sat in this tiny little room, and the only heat at first was from the back of the computer monitors.
So we got a gas fire.
That was the first Revolution hardware beyond the PC.
Yeah. But when you've got a gas fire, you've got to have ventilation. And the only ventilation was the window. So we had the window open, which meant it was freezing.
It got colder.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we had.
Well, that's all right.
So we were sat there, and then behind us, like rammed up against where you are, was the heater, and all around us was the carbon monoxide.
Yeah.
When you started work, you started here, yeah.
Yeah.
So that was like the 1st of April, wasn't it?
Something like that, yeah.
Right. Well, I think we were here through the summer, like end of summer.
Now, Hull was very welcoming, wasn't it? And Radio Humberside used to, interview us, and there was a real enthusiasm for what we were doing.
It was very exciting.
It was exciting, yeah.
We didn't have any money coming in. We had no guarantee. But the vision that I was excited about was the next generation of adventure games. And of course, we'd looked at the success of Sierra, but King's Quest in particular took itself much, much too seriously. What we wanted to do, at about the same time that LucasArts was actually being formed, but they went down the Maniac Mansion route, which was much more slapstick, and we went down a game that was going to become Lyra the Temptress, which was the idea that characters would walk around this adventure world talking to each other, conveying gossip, and that when you needed to solve a puzzle with a particular character, they could be anywhere in the world.
So Lure the Temptress was the first game that used our virtual theatre system, and the whole idea of that came from our meeting with Charles in Wales was that it would be a whole world running at the same time, and it would have characters walking from room to room, and you'd be able to string these lists of commands together, like you'd be able to tell someone to go to this other place, do this, get this, then return to me and give me the thing, and it was a great piece of technology, and it helped us sell the game in the end, and people stood up and cheered when they saw it working. Although the irony was that it was actually very difficult to design any gameplay around, but in those days we weren't really designing anything. We didn't have a game design. We didn't really have a plan. We just went away and we started programming in the way that you did. And Dave and I would code, and then we'd get bored and we'd go to Wales and we'd sit in their cottage and we'd drink wine and we'd code all night, and then we'd come back and go, "Hey, look, Charles, we've done this great thing," and we don't remember doing it, but we've done it, and it's completely random, but we just kept going backwards and forwards, and cobbled this game together out of nothing, and that was the Temptress.
And it was really, really great. I mean, it was a great idea. But as I say, we needed Mirrorsoft to buy into this because we had very little money.
There was this dread that if we fail, what do we do next? Because we're putting everything into this.
Really, we'd had a number of key products there. We had flight simulators. We had more mass market product we were trying to get into. But really, it was the industry was starting to change then. What we really wanted to do, I suppose, was in our portfolio was have a more critically acclaimed titles. So more titles that the press would like, because it's easy to build a brand that way, and also in terms of the kind of the ownership of the IP. I guess at the time, if you're always producing licensed games, you never own the IP. You could generate a lot of revenue and profit from those in the short term, but there's no long term substance to it. So I think we were looking at expanding the portfolio in that way.
So when the game was commissioned by Mirrorsoft, we decided that we were going to take on a little office, which actually was in a block called Warehouse 13 in Hull. It was actually a really, really nice area.
Warehouse 13 compared to above a fruit shop in Chancellors Avenue. This was luxury.
I guess it was a big
height
step
of
up.
luxury.
Yeah.
And it was extraordinary. It was really fun, wasn't it? Because it was a lovely little flat overlooking the marina.
It was fantastic.
The sound of the lines clinking together.
Yeah, it was brilliant.
And
And it was really close to everything.
And it was just a real shame that we outgrew it so quickly.
I know, but they're only flats, aren't they?
They are only flats.
Yeah.
And you're not supposed to run a business from them.
Oh,
And
yeah.
we weren't.
Apart
yes.
from that,
Yes.
Yeah.
That was always the fear that we'd be discovered.
So while it's lovely to reminisce, it is blooming cold. And this restaurant certainly wasn't here
No,
when we
that
were
wasn't here.
around.
There's
So
nothing like
perhaps
that.
we should go and have a coffee and maybe
That
some
sounds
lunch.
like a great idea.
Excellent. Let's go.
And during that time, we installed Dave Cummins. Now, Dave had been a tester with me at Activision. He'd worked for me at Activision. And the wonderful thing about Dave was he wrote beautifully. And when he wrote his bug reports, I remember him writing about a particular adventure game. And he wrote so much better than the adventure game writers. It was sort of totally ironic. And so I invited him to come and work for Revolution, which he did. So he came and lived in Hull. And we then started looking around for people who could work as background artists and animators. And there was a fellow called Steve Oates, and he sent in some of his animation. He was local. He was brilliant. He was utterly brilliant. And he became, for many years, our key animation expert. Hugely talented guy. So fairly quickly we outgrew Warehouse 13 and moved to a pretty dingy little office on a road called Ferrens Way in Hull, and that gave us the opportunity to expand.
I was looking back through the records, and I found what's probably the first communication to Turnvale, which was of course the name of the company before we changed it to Revolution, and it's from Sean Brennan, dated the 21st of August 1990, saying, I'd like to express our interest in working with you on your new game development system.
Sean was fantastic at judging what the market was, and he was a great advocate and supporter of the games that we wrote. At the same time, Mirrorsoft was publishing games from a company called Bitmap Brothers, who were super cool. They were the sort of rock stars of the video games industry. What Mirrorsoft got them to do was pose like rock stars with sunglasses on, and they looked great. And then they did the same to us, and it was fantastic. It was a great time.
Compared to other industries, we were way behind. The way the music industry promoted artists or the film industry did, we were nowhere in that league. Quite frankly, we did very, very simple things: photo shoots of the developer in classic kind of poses. It just made it a lot easier to market them because we were marketing the guys, people, as opposed to just games and brands.
We were taken by a sort of rather funky, interesting photographer down to the docks in Hull and given whisks and light bulbs and things, and we posed for that, and that in many ways created the image that we had as being sort of slightly avant-garde, and it worked very well, and Sean continued throughout our relationship with Virgin to very much push us and me as the face of Revolution, dealing directly with the press, which I think was good for Virgin because it meant that we got more coverage, and it was certainly great for me because it meant that when we moved on from Virgin, I had a direct relationship with the press.
So guys, this is where we had our very first big photo shoot.
This is where Sean organised us to become the rock stars of the video games industry. If it was good enough for the Bitbat brothers, it was good enough for us. And why were you not part of this? What was your reason for not partaking?
I was probably 8 months pregnant at the time, and I just felt very big and bulky, and I just didn't think I could carry off the rock star image. And I stood out.
It was good enough for Demi Moore 5-6 years later.
I know, I do regret it. I've regretted it ever since.
Oh, shame.
So, yeah, here I am.
Now's your chance.
Now's your chance to be the rock star.
We were getting close to completing a game that was called Vengeance. And it was clearly a rubbish name, and we were going to come up with something better. And I came up with a long list of names.
Charles had sent a list of names to our marketing manager at the time, Alison Beasley, and a whole list there. At the bottom of it was a list, Lure of the Temptress, in brackets, don't use this at all, ha ha. And she liked it. You know, she was very creative, still is, I think, to this day. But she liked the name. So yeah, I'd love to use it. Charles said there's only two problems with that.
Firstly, there's no luring in the game, and secondly, there's no temptress. And there was a beat, and then she said, well, can you put them in? And I said, well, we can put them in, but that'll add considerably to the budget and the time and everything. And she said, yeah, we were a little bit worried that the game was a bit small. So yeah, we'll give you an extra 6 months, and can you stick the luring and the temptress in so we can call it Lure of the Temptress?
It was a curious story because it bore no resemblance to whatever went on in the game, quite frankly, but we went with it nonetheless, and I guess the rest is history.
And that then allowed the artwork in the way that it was. And it had repercussions, of course, because it changed, I guess, the opening story and things like that. But in the end, the game had a luring and the temptress, and was called Lure of the Temptress. And before Mirrorsoft had the opportunity to publish it, they went bankrupt, and so they never got to see it.
We'd signed the game and we were ready to publish it at Mirrorsoft, and then what happened there towards the end was that Mr. Maxwell, Robert Maxwell, had apparently either committed suicide, fell off his yacht, whatever tended to happen to him, and conspiracy theorists may at the time suggested other scenarios, but we were put into administration due to that fact, even though the company was solvent, was cash positive and profitable, but because we were caught up in the whole kind of shenanigans of the whole Maxwell empire and the issues with the pension funds, etc. At the time, the company was put into administration and then was duly bought by an American company called Acclaim. I'd moved then to Virgin to join Tim Cheney, who'd set up Virgin joined Virgin rather the previous year, and he was a prominent figure at US Gold, but he'd been employed by Robert Devereux at Virgin to run Virgin Games. So Tim hired me. And then at the time, we were looking at some of the assets that Mirrorsoft had and some of the developers we were working with, and decided that Revolution was one of the better opportunities there. So Virgin signed the game, and then the game was actually published at Virgin.
The administrators for Mirrorsoft were pressuring us to sign the game over to them, basically, or the creditors of the company. And I remember correctly, they sent everybody. It was us and all the other developers from Mirrorsoft. We all got a fax through, and it had it basically said you must sign this and agree to everything we say, and you will be signing this game over to us and all the rest of it. And there were 2 boxes, if I remember, and one said no and one said yes, and we ticked ours no and sent it back to them. And I remember there was a story of the Bitmap brothers who were well known to be quite amusing people at the time, and they actually wrote another box saying "F off," and they ticked that and faxed it back to these receivers.
After that, they dropped the aggression and they released us from the contract, and we subsequently signed with Virgin, where of course Sean Brennan again, the relationship with Sean. We followed Sean to Virgin.
And he signed us at Mirrorsoft and basically re-signed the game for Virgin, luckily. So he knew the game and still liked it. So we finished it with Virgin, and they published it. And they were very keen on the game, liked it, and patented the engine and everything like that, and backed it and pushed it. And that was a really good thing for us. And I think that's part of its success, the fact that it went to Virgin.
It got amazing reviews. It was the top of the UK Gallup charts. We had an amazing response to it, which was fantastic for us. Virgin were so pleased that they signed the next project, which would be Steel Sky.